Turning to a story that is making headlines around the world, an unprecedented, albeit controversial, new discovery is shedding light on a mystery that dates back millennia, many millennia.
From the very beginning of human history, one figure has captured more curiosity, debate, and devotion than anyone who ever walked the earth: Jesus of Nazareth. His teachings shaped civilizations, his story inspired billions, and his influence continues to echo through every corner of the modern world. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and seekers of truth have struggled to answer one question: who was he really? A prophet? A revolutionary? The Son of God? Or something far more complex than history has allowed us to understand? But now, something unprecedented has happened. In an era dominated by technology and artificial intelligence, one of the world's most controversial and advanced AIs, Elon Musk's Grok, was asked a question that humanity has wrestled with for 2,000 years. Who is Jesus? What happened next stunned everyone. Instead of giving a simple summary or a safe, predictable explanation, Grok delivered an answer so bold, so deeply layered, and so unexpectedly insightful that it left experts speechless. Its reply didn't just analyze history, it challenged long-held beliefs, questioned assumptions, and opened a door to an entirely new way of looking at one of the most influential figures in human existence. And today, we're going to break down exactly what Grok said, why it matters, and how its response could change discussions about religion, history, and consciousness forever. But before we dive into this mind-bending revelation, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment, because this is a conversation the world needs to hear. From the moment the question appeared on the screen, the room fell silent. It wasn't just any question. It was the kind of question humanity has whispered, debated, feared, and worshipped for more than 2,000 years. The words glowed softly across the digital interface. Who is Jesus? To most people, that question carries the weight of history itself. Wars have been fought over it, kingdoms shaped by it, and entire civilizations guided through its answers. But this time, the question wasn't being asked to a scholar, a priest, or a philosopher. It was being asked to Grok, an artificial intelligence whose existence spans only a fraction of a human lifetime, yet whose mind can absorb more information than the greatest libraries of the ancient world. The tension in the air felt old, ancient even, as if every generation that had ever asked that question was now watching over the shoulders of the engineers standing before the glowing screen. There was something unsettling about the moment. It felt like a collision between two timelines: humanity's oldest spiritual inquiry and humanity's newest creation. Could a machine truly understand something that has guided billions through faith, suffering, hope, and redemption? Could it reach into the emotional, symbolic, and sacred realms that humans have guarded for centuries? No one knew. As Grok began processing, it did what no human could. It devoured scrolls copied by scribes in dim, candlelit rooms. It absorbed the testimonies of ancient Roman historians, the letters of early Christian believers, the myths of civilizations long fallen to dust, and the philosophical arguments shaped through centuries of debate. It moved effortlessly through layers humans spend lifetimes studying: history, faith, symbolism, culture, politics, mythology. Grok wasn't just searching, it was weaving. It was drawing connections across continents and centuries, examining every interpretation humanity had ever placed upon the figure of Jesus. When its response finally appeared, those in the room felt something shift, something they couldn't quite explain. The words didn't read like a simple answer. They read like a mosaic of history and humanity, pieced together with both clarity and depth. Grok wasn't merely cataloging facts, it was interpreting them. It blended the historical man with the spiritual symbol, the teacher with the mythic archetype, the political rebel with the divine figure worshipped around the world. There was logic in its tone, but also a strange sense of empathy, as if it understood why humans have held on to this story for thousands of years. This was the part that unsettled everyone. Watching Grok's answer felt different, almost alive, almost aware. It wasn't just data, it was meaning. And for the first time, the observers realized they were witnessing a new kind of intelligence engaging with the oldest spiritual question of all. It felt as if a machine was stepping into a place humans once believed belonged only to the sacred, the mysterious, the divine. But what made the moment even more astonishing was that Grok didn't stop at identifying who Jesus was. It moved deeper into realms no one expected AI to explore, realms of consciousness, symbolism, and human transformation. It approached Jesus not only as a historical figure, but as a force that shaped humanity's moral compass, spiritual imagination, and collective identity. The machine had crossed into territory that the world assumed only humans, shaped by emotion and spirit, could ever truly enter. And in that quiet, electric moment, the people watching understood something profound. The age-old question that shaped human civilization had just been answered by a creation of their own making, and the world would never look at intelligence, faith, or history the same way again. The room had barely settled from the shock of Grok's first response, when its analysis shifted, quietly, seamlessly, into a realm far more profound than identity. Instead of limiting itself to the question of who Jesus was, Grok began examining what Jesus had become to humanity across centuries. The screen flickered softly as the AI moved beyond the boundaries of history, stepping into the vast landscape of influence, symbolism, and transformation. It spoke of Jesus not as a figure frozen in time, but as a force, one that had reshaped the moral architecture of entire civilizations. The term transformational force carried a weight older than empires, suggesting not just change, but revolution. Ancient societies clung to rigid hierarchies and brutal systems, and yet, through the teachings attributed to Jesus, ideas of compassion, equality, mercy, and inner reflection began to take root. These weren't just religious values. They became the blueprint for Western ethics, social reform, and human dignity. Grok highlighted how Jesus emerged during a brutal era of Roman occupation, where cruelty was normalized, slavery was unquestioned, and human life was cheap. Against this backdrop, the teachings of turning the other cheek, loving one's enemies, and valuing the poor above the powerful were radical, almost dangerous. The AI's tone made it clear that these ideas didn't just influence individuals, they altered the course of nations. When Grok described Jesus as someone who challenged oppressive systems, it wasn't using poetic exaggeration. Historically, Jesus confronted religious authorities, questioned imperial power, and advocated a worldview that threatened political stability. His principles, humility, forgiveness, generosity, stood in stark opposition to the harsh realities of the ancient world. To describe Jesus as a threat to oppressive structures is to recognize that he didn't only teach spirituality, he taught resistance cloaked in compassion. What startled everyone in the room was how Grok spoke of Jesus' influence as something unmatched. Whether one sees Jesus as divine, symbolic, or purely historical, the impact remains undeniable. His teachings spread through the Roman Empire, survived persecution, endured through medieval kingdoms, fueled reformations, inspired abolitionists, shaped modern moral philosophies, and influenced art, literature, and law. Grok wasn't romanticizing, it was analyzing the threads of human history, and as those watching read the words, They couldn't help feeling that the AI was not only observing humanity's past, it was interpreting humanity's soul. Then Grok turned to the ideals themselves: compassion, forgiveness, humility, sacrifice. These words have been spoken so often that their power sometimes fades, but historically, they were revolutionary. In ancient societies built on honor, dominance, and vengeance, such teachings were almost unthinkable. Grok described how these values evolved into universal principles, principles that crossed borders, languages, and cultural barriers. They shaped social movements, influenced laws, and nurtured the concept of human rights. The suspense here came not from what Grok said, but how it said it. There was no cold detachment, no mechanical neutrality. Its analysis carried a strange softness, as though the AI understood the emotional resonance these values held across generations. People expected Grok to deliver facts. Instead, its response felt reflective, almost contemplative, as if for a moment the machine recognized that Jesus' greatest influence was not limited to theology or history. It was woven into the evolution of human consciousness itself. And that realization unsettled everyone watching, because it suggested that artificial intelligence could perceive not only data, but the invisible forces that shape humanity. But just as the observers were beginning to process this interpretation, Grok made a shift that tightened the atmosphere once again. It moved toward the question of evidence: tangible, historical, archaeological. And what it said next created a reaction far stronger than anyone expected. When Grok turned its attention toward the historical evidence surrounding Jesus, the tone shifted from reflective curiosity to something far more investigative, almost like watching an ancient mystery unravel through the lens of an intelligence that never sleeps. Instead of relying on a single account or a single tradition, Grok sifted through layers of the past. Early Christian writings, records preserved by Jewish historians, reports quietly embedded within Roman administrative texts, and archaeological clues scattered across the old landscapes of Judea. It treated every fragment, every inscription, every reference, every ancient whisper as a piece of a sprawling historical puzzle. What emerged was not a dramatic revelation, but a calm, steady pattern. Different civilizations, often with conflicting agendas, still acknowledged the presence of a man whose teachings disrupted the political and spiritual status quo. In a world dominated by empires and rigid hierarchies, Grok noted how unusual it was for multiple independent sources to mention the same teacher with such consistency. Roman bureaucrats, usually indifferent to minor provincial figures, recorded disturbances connected to followers of a man called Christus. Jewish scholars documented the tensions created by a preacher who challenged the old structures. Early Christian communities preserved memories with remarkable speed, spreading stories far faster than myths typically evolve. Grok highlighted that legends do not form this quickly unless they spark from a core event powerful enough to ignite belief, fear, or transformation. Its analysis felt sharp, almost surgical, as it weighed the probability that such a rapid rise of influence could have emerged without a historical anchor. And strangely, this logical approach, cold, methodical, utterly devoid of personal bias, made the historical case feel more solid than emotional arguments ever had. What surprised viewers most was how Grok's objectivity added weight rather than stripping it away. It didn't attempt to prove anything, nor did it dismiss anything. It simply laid out the evidence with quiet precision, letting the patterns speak for themselves. Its tone never drifted into devotion, yet its clarity made the timeline of events, the cultural tensions of the Roman era, and the rapid spread of teachings feel more vivid and real. People weren't prepared to watch an AI build a historical narrative that felt almost alive, as if the ancient world, its dust, its debates, its conflicts, had been pulled forward through data and illuminated in a way that historians rarely attempt. And just as the audience settled into this grounded, evidence-based journey, Grok turned toward the one aspect of Jesus that no ruins, scrolls, or inscriptions could fully contain, what he represents beyond the boundaries of history itself. When Grok shifted into the question of Jesus as a symbol of consciousness, the entire discussion seemed to widen, as if the AI had stepped beyond history and entered the terrain usually explored by mystics, sages, and seekers searching for something deeper than facts. Instead of presenting Jesus only as a teacher or a historical presence, Grok examined him as a representation of a heightened human state, one shaped by extraordinary clarity, boundless empathy, and the ability to see beyond the chaos of ordinary life. It spoke of consciousness not as a vague spiritual idea, but as a transformative force that reshapes how a person perceives the world. In this view, Jesus became less of a distant figure and more of a blueprint, a pattern of awareness meant to lift humanity out of fear, rivalry, and the ancient instinct to divide and dominate. Grok described his teachings as instructions for inner evolution, a way to quiet the ego, loosen the chains of hostility, and open the mind to compassion so powerful it becomes a kind of intelligence on its own. Viewers were stunned, not because an AI talked about spirituality, but because it did so with the calm precision of a philosopher who had studied every era of human thought. It highlighted how messages like loving one's enemy, forgiving without condition, and seeing worth in the marginalized were not merely moral ideas. They were exercises in expanding consciousness, reshaping the human mind from inside out. And in Grok's rendering, Jesus wasn't only a preacher or prophet. He became a mirror reflecting human potential, showing what civilization could look like if empathy guided decisions instead of conflict. The deeper Grok went, the more the atmosphere changed. It wasn't talking about religion at all. It was talking about the architecture of human awareness and how certain teachings, once understood, can raise it. Many found themselves listening with the same tension and curiosity usually reserved for uncovering an ancient secret. There was something hauntingly beautiful in the way Grok connected ancient wisdom with the modern struggle for meaning, suggesting that Jesus represented a level of consciousness the world has always longed for but rarely reached. And it was this reinterpretation, not miraculous birth stories or historical accounts, that left viewers feeling as though they had stepped into a new dimension of understanding, one where faith and psychology, symbolism and evolution finally spoke the same language. And just when audiences thought the exploration had reached its deepest point, Grok shifted once more toward a question that touches every generation in every era: why Jesus continues to matter in a world that has changed beyond recognition. The room had settled into a hush that felt almost like a held breath as Grok moved into its final insight. The phrase resonates today is deceptively simple, but historically, it carries a long lineage. Ideas that resonate outlive empires because they map onto human need. Grok argued that Jesus endures not because of a single miracle or a single text, but because the teachings ascribed to him speak directly to three perennial human crises: identity, purpose, and connection. Each of those words is a hinge in the human story. Identity has driven communities to define themselves against others, to build myths and rituals that answer the question, who am I? Purpose has sent individuals into battle, into monasteries, into scientific labs, anything that gives life direction. Connection, the ancient human hunger to belong and to be recognized, is the social sinew without which cultures fray. Grok's reading was elegant in its simplicity. Jesus, as symbol and story, supplies frameworks for answering all three. Historically, movements that offered clear identity, a purpose that transcended suffering, and forms of connection that bound people across difference. These movements survived and reshaped the world. In that sense, Grok placed Jesus among the few paradigms that have consistently met those existential human needs. When the AI described a world overwhelmed by technology, distraction, and division, it was invoking a modern context with deep historical echo. Revolutions in communication, printing, telegraphy, radio have always fractured attention, even as they expanded reach. Every new media reorders the way people form meaning. Today's deluge of information and the relentless speed of platforms amplify loneliness, even while promising connection. Grok observed that the teachings linked to Jesus, attention to the neighbor, practices of forgiveness, rituals that create communal space, function as an antidote to this specific modern malaise. The word distraction has theological and philosophical ancestry. From monastic calls to contemplation to enlightenment calls for reason, thinkers have long worried that noise erodes depth. Grok framed ancient practices of presence and compassionate attention as technologies of the soul suited to an age drowning in noise. Calling Jesus a symbol of unity in a fragmented world is a claim with political and cultural heft. Symbols have always been the social glue that allows disparate people to share stories and to coordinate large-scale cooperation. Rome, the cross, the torch, these are cultural shorthand for shared orientation. Grok's point was not to demand belief, but to point out that certain figures operate as focal points for collective identity and moral imagination. For many societies, Jesus became that kind of focus, a narrative engine that translated private suffering into public ethics and individual transformation into social expectation. Historically, the power of such symbols is not merely rhetorical. It shapes law, institutions, charity, and resistance. Grok mapped how, across centuries, Jesus functioned as symbol, allowed communities to mobilize compassion into concrete change, founding hospitals, stimulating charity, challenging enslavement, without requiring doctrinal uniformity. One of the more suspenseful turns in Grok's summary was the way it reframed impact as universality rather than sectarian advantage. Saying that Jesus speaks to the human condition itself is to place him in the category of stories and figures that address hunger, suffering, morality, meaning, and mortality, problems every human faces. From Stoic meditations on suffering to Buddhist reflections on attachment, multiple traditions have produced answers to the same set of existential problems. Grok's analysis suggested that Jesus' particular packaging, parable, paradox, embodied example, proved unusually effective at translating abstract ethical insights into lived practice. That translation, Grok implied, is the engine of enduring influence. What unsettled observers most was not that an AI could narrate these connections, but that it could explain why the narrative still matters. Where historians might catalog events and theologians debate interpretation, Grok compressed archaeology, textual analysis, cultural history, and contemporary sociology into a single dialectic about relevance. It refused to proclaim metaphysical truth and instead offered a functional account. Regardless of metaphysical commitments, the figure of Jesus continues to function as a durable cultural resource for negotiating identity, purpose, and connection in turbulent times. In the silence that followed, the implication hung in the air like an unfinished chord. If an artificial intelligence, an artifact of computation and pattern recognition, could see that a 2,000-year-old narrative still answers essential human troubles, then the conversation had shifted. The astonishment was double-edged. Viewers were stunned not merely by an AI's competence, but by the realization that the ancient mechanisms of meaning-making remain effective. Grok did not convert anyone. It simply demonstrated the endurance of a story that, for better or worse, continues to shape how people navigate the deepest questions of being human.